So I think it makes sense to start this conversation with some history. So Adam, as a historian, let's start by building some context around this moment and talk about how we got here, what led to disinvestment in Chicago South and West Side neighborhoods.
Well, I think the short answer is that we got here not by accident. And it's important to think about the ways in which the challenges and the difficulties that we face are the product of really decades of choices. When I teach about Chicago, and it's challenging in terms of sort of wrapping one's head around this legacy, I teach a great deal about segregation and the ways in which we think about segregation. We're all, of course, familiar with the importance of segregation and the challenges even today that it poses. But I think there's some keywords about segregation that we have to grasp. Segregation is something that is comprehensive in terms of its impact on the city. It affects where you have access to jobs. It affects how you're able to access housing. More recently, it's affected what kind of access you have to schools. It impacts the degree to which you're able to leverage, the positive aspects of your culture and your society. And it can, as was just stated before, impact the ways in which you have good health or even a healthy lifespan in relation to your time here. Segregation is also, as I said before, the product of choices. Choices like the desire to institute restrictive covenants around the city. Choices like approach to disparate policing over many, many decades within the city. And it's important to sort that notion that it comes from choices from the premise that it's just really coincidence, that people just find themselves in the communities that they find themselves in. That's not really the case, and we have to acknowledge that. Segregation is also something that compounds. Each time, for example, a factory or an industry leaves a particular neighborhood, that results in larger capital flight from that neighborhood. Each time people are challenged in relation to difficulties in terms of education, that sets a kind of dynamic whereby people are disinvesting in terms of human development, more from outside than from inside. And that becomes something that just creates challenges. Now, to be sure, the fact that this is a segregated city has also meant that people have had to be self-reliant. They've had to build assets. And I think that one of the things that's extraordinary about the city of Chicago and its history is how much has come out of local communities, how much has come out of people within their neighborhoods, and everything ranging from churches to legacies of music to the cookouts that are soundtracked with house music that one sees, or the family reunions that are taking place in the parks that Mr. Traubert talked about. These become legacies for communities. But at the same time, those legacies can be endangered precisely by the way in which segregation disincentivizes people from thinking about partnership, investment, and just a basic acknowledgement of humanity. I think one of the things that's powerful about this competition is the way in which we're trained to appreciate the human value of communities in a way that segregation often says that we should never really acknowledge and appreciate. And that's, in a sense, precisely the reversal of history that Chicago needs in order to move itself to a better place. Mm-hmm.
Commissioner Cox, you recently arrived here in Chicago. When you first considered coming here, what excited you about coming to the city? Where did you see the potential and the opportunities here?
Wow. There was a lot that excited me. I've always lived in incredibly diverse communities. And one of the things that attracted me so much was the way that Chicago has evolved in terms of its racial diversity, to have Asians, Latino, African Americans, and whites in significant numbers coexisting. I felt that is a kind of city that I would want to live in, and how you hold on to that diversity and use that as a strength. I also was very, very attracted to the reputation that Chicago has as a city of neighborhoods, and that the soul of this city resides there, and the opportunity that the mayor laid out to begin to genuinely invest and lift up those neighborhoods, that was an amazing draw to me. I also, I'm a big city person. I grew up in New York City. Never thought I would live in a truly global city again, and to be able to do that and stay in the Midwest for from Detroit was an amazing attraction. So I also am a believer that the city that we have is a city that has been intentionally constructed. And so when you look at what Chicago is today, you understand that public policy created this city. And as a planner who believes in that we can genuinely shape our world, that means that public policy can create a different city. I think that's the challenge that we've been given.
Well, with that in mind, the city recently launched I want to make sure I say it correctly, Invest Southwest
Yes.
initiative. How do you imagine that initiative reshaping the city?
Sure. Well, I think it's a pretty direct call to action to Chicago to invest in the South Side and invest in the West Side. So it's a declaration that this administration believes that the future of Chicago is embedded in that enormous sleeping asset in the South and West Sides of Chicago. So I think the first thing, as people try to double down on their effort to make the city, to hold the city up, to know what direction we're going in is vitally important. And so for a mayor to declare that allows all of the individual efforts that people are pursuing to coalesce into a single direction. And so the Chicago Prize all of a sudden made even more sense when the mayor reinforced that initial impulse from the Pritzker Foundation. And so I think that the communities that I have seen, I mean, I've been traveling pretty extensively with determination to visit every square mile of the city, and to do this accompanied by aldermen, which we've been doing aldermanic tours of the city. But to see, Woodlawn and Jackson Park in the same day that you're seeing Lincoln Park is a shocking contrast that I think kind of motivates me, and to know that we are clearly on the right track when we pronounce this investment strategy for the West and South Sides.
Well, Cindy, I want to come to you because I'm curious why you decided to take this particular approach, a $10 million community challenge.
So Brian talked a lot about the values and the mission of the foundation, and also what we're hoping to accomplish. I want to just make a note that when Adam talks about the choices that we made to get to the neighborhoods, and the commissioner talks about policies causing this and policies needing to undo this, I think we've all felt that we as individuals were part of that policy, and we as individuals have to all work together to undo the harm that was done. And I think a lot of the investment that's coming out of foundations and a lot of the people who have been working so hard on neighborhoods, one, believe that this is the right thing to do, and two, believe that it's the right thing to do for all of Chicago, not just for the neighborhoods. So I would say that when the foundation decided to make its mission to increase economic opportunity in the city of Chicago, we, as Brian mentioned, really struggled with how to do this. And the fact that we are now aligned with people like the mayor and the commissioner of planning in terms of how we did this and how we're listening to communities has really sort of allowed us to feel like we're on the right track, that the track is to listen to people in the neighborhoods, to ask them which communities and which teams can make a difference, to ask how they would leverage our resources, and how they would allow us to be a partner in making positive impact, and also helping them get to feasibility and helping them to get to a feasible plan. So, our hope is, as we look around this room, that we keep, as we reach out and become good partners, the tent keeps getting bigger and bigger. And that's what we're going to need to solve some of these big issues.
Jose, talk a little bit more about the importance of centering community voice when we're talking about investment.
Yeah, so I consider myself a neighborhood guy. I grew up in Little Village and still live there in Little Village, raising my kids there in Little Village. And one thing that I see every day is that we, in many of our communities, we're still suffering from the legacy of racism that Adam talked about. And so we see a lot of people and organizations that have a lot of healing to do, because what happens when we have all these barriers to access to capital and we have this forced separation and people are forced to leave, whether it's the country or to prison, is we see that many of our neighborhoods just have broken relationships. And for me, what I find amazing in the communities and many of the people that are here is that despite this historic disinvestment, where, for example, my parents worked at the Brock's factory, and when it closed down, we had to scramble and move to the other part of Little Village. And I see that in schools as a high school principal, where I had 30% of my high school students move every year because of something that happened in one gang territory in that part of the neighborhood. So a lot of what it's happening is repairing relationships. And I think, sometimes I see philanthropy not helping because we sometimes fund programs and in silos. So I really want to congratulate, the Pritzker Traubert Foundation, Chicago Community Trust, United Way under the leadership of Sean, to really think about how can we look at the philanthropy that we give to support leaders on the ground, not just for individual programs, but really to repair relationships, strengthen institutions, and ensure that the voice of community members really come out to ensure that their vision is at the table, because for what they want, not for an outcome in a grant guideline.
Jenn, let me just also add that this is a learning journey for our foundation, but I actually think it's a learning journey for all of us. Because one thing we realized when we started talking to our counterparts and people in the community about community development is that there were no easy answers. So as we start working towards addressing some of the issues that have been presented here and that Jose just mentioned, is we are trying this method, but we want the feedback. We don't know if we're getting this right. And we really believe in the teams that are moving forward. But in every phone call we've had with everyone, we've said, please tell us what's happening, tell us what's working, tell us what's not. Because I think that these are really difficult, obviously very difficult problems. And a lot of the people in this room have been working on these for years, if not decades. So we just have to be working together.
But something Jose said, it's a conversation we have a lot in our newsroom about how difficult it is to have honest conversations about race, segregation, how that impacts policy, how we detangle it. And from a historical perspective, Adam, are there any lessons we can apply now to help us have some of those honest conversations and clearly identify where policy has been driven by racism?
Well, I think one way to approach it, which I think is the way that you're suggesting, is that we need a language. We need to speak the words that sort of speak to the truth. We need to recognize that we have to listen to one another. Oftentimes around the hard truths of the ways in which maybe not everybody is actively complicit in relation to putting this together, but many, many people enable it. In the sense that you turn your head when you see a community that seems unplugged, that's significantly under-resourced, and you try to come to some explanation about what's missing in that community, rather than what has been sort of constructed around that community to really reduce the opportunity for it to ever build the capacity that enables it to realize its full potential. But I also think that some of this is just about habits. It's not even necessarily about the words. If we're committed to listening, and if we're committed to reckoning with the truth, so many of you I know are engaged in thinking about the place of reconciliation, of truth-telling in terms of thinking about history and impacts of policy. When those kinds of mechanisms are in place, we take in a habitus of probably coming to a sense of creating the language that we need. And that language, in many ways, did not exist in the 20th century, certainly not at the point of city government or the real estate board or, sadly, the school board or, quite likely, I think, the police department in terms of the major administrative structures within the city. Now we have an opportunity to get that common language, but in some ways it's the processes that we have in place that will enable us to invent that language that we need for the 21st century. And that's where I think the prize is very powerful and inspiring in this. It's the process, in some ways, that I think is bringing us to an understanding of what new kinds of conversations that we can have. And that's the thing, as a historian, to me, that's most compelling about this.
Commissioner Cox.
Yeah, I mean, the flip side of the segregation is that communities still have a complement of people who, from all walks of life, all shapes, all educational attainments, that still live there, they never abandon their community. So I was traveling with Alderman Mike Scott. His wife is an attorney. They're raising their kids in the West Side. And so it's folks like that and the full spectrum of Black culture that allows me to believe that we can rebuild from those fabrics a community that everyone could be very, very proud of. So while it sounds like we're saying that there is a deficit or there is something wrong that happened, that these communities are still in many ways cohesive, I actually think those are the foundations on which we can rebuild them. And so, you know, we have to undo the systems that allowed the disinvestment to happen. We can change that, but I want to keep those communities intact, and I want those creative minds to be a part of what the future provides for them.
Part of that rebuilding process is reestablishing trust with neighborhoods and city government. How will you approach that part of the work?
Sure. I mean, I think that, you know, planners have to own the history that we are now living with. Urban renewal. I mean, when you have a community meeting, there are people in the room who remember when their communities were dismantled. Folks who know that public housing for low-income residents, they can remember when the schools were shut down. You have people in the room who lived that experience. So you have to earn their trust again. And I think it starts from having a really honest conversation where those who are able to bring resources to the table are there to listen and to learn and to, again, bring the resources necessary. That's what's so compelling about the Chicago Prize. The ideas came from the community. What the foundation is offering is we have a way of attracting those resources and allowing these visions to come about. So I think it begins with taking a lot of individuals who come together and find a collective direction that they all agree on going with. And to do that, you have to meet, you have to organize, and you have to be able to bring other resources, whether they be technical, financial, to the table to lift up those ideas.
Jose?
And I think that's exactly the role that philanthropy could play, right? To be able to bring people together, to have those conversations, to be able to build that trust. I think being able to provide $100,000 for organizations to be able to build their capacity, to do more of that community building, and really building that civic muscle that, frankly, we need to build in the city of Chicago, and those new processes that we need to implement. You know, one of the things that we're doing right now is we're creating racial healing circles across the city with the help of philanthropy to really talk about my role and our role here in the city based on who we are and where we're from. Because my identity as a Chicagoan is based on 23rd and California, where I grew up, and the people around me. That's the identity that we see each other, but how often do we have philanthropy or other organizations support me going across the viaduct to 21st and California and have this conversation in North Lawndale, right? So that's an important role I think that philanthropy could play, and we need to make sure that we build those processes.
You know, one thing we did in terms of establishing the Chicago Prize is to say, define your neighborhood. We didn't say it had to be a ward. We didn't say it had to be a community area. We said, you tell us what your neighborhood is, who works in your neighborhood, what the people in your neighborhood need, and we really asked you to define that. The way they're moving forward with the 100,000 in the planning grant is really to say, where are you in the process? Some of you have been working for years. Some of you have just joined together for this prize. So you're going to have different needs. And I have to give my trustees, there are 3 trustees here, Kevin Poorman and Brian and Penny are here, and I have to give them a lot of credit because they are willing to put resources in without dictating how they're being used right now. And they also were willing to take the chance and put $10 million on the table without really knowing what was going to come out of this competition. So I just want to actually take a minute and I want to give these guys some applause because I think it's really important. I know they don't want those applause. So anyway, but I do want to say that what Jose is saying is that it's really, we have to work really hard to put the resources in play and then be a partner at the table.
Cindy, what do you think has been the steepest part of the learning curve?
Well, I think it's to come, actually. You know, as much as this is a wonderful celebration, we're at the beginning. And we actually asked people for their ideas and didn't ask them for all that much detail. We asked them for some, but not all that much detail, because we wanted to actually set a bar that wouldn't cause people to put an enormous amount of work, knowing that we were only going to give out one prize. So we actually have done a survey of all the 80 proposals that have come in, and half the groups have answered, and it took about 20 to 50 hours to apply, which is still a significant amount of work. But now the real work comes. I mean, one of the reasons we are providing that $100,000 is that we know in the next 5 months, we're going to ask each of these groups to really put pen to paper and get as much expertise as they need and really give us a concrete plan about how this is executable. And that's the challenge ahead. So I think our learning is yet to come.
Jose, looking through the list of finalists, these are ambitious projects. What will it take for these projects not just to succeed, but be able to sustain the work they're doing beyond?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when you look at a lot of the work that was put together, it's not dependent on one big project, right? The successful ones are going to have multiple projects in a different area, supported by different groups to make sure that you actually build wealth and buy-in from different sectors of the community. And I think that's a really good lesson for us here in Chicago, where we like big, huge projects that are going to try to revitalize one whole section of the city. But those of us from the neighborhood know, we always look at that, we're like, that ain't going to work.
Break it down.
So we know that we need to ensure that we get as many people in the neighborhood involved and ensure that the people that are involved in that work have the buy-in, but also rooted in the community, and that we build the wealth to stay in that neighborhood.
Commissioner Cox was saying, break it down, break it down.
Yeah, no, I think the best way to go about this is to do it incrementally, to set out a big, audacious vision, and then break it down into bite-sized components that can be delivered. Because I think that process, one, again, it rescales the challenge that you face, because these are big challenges, but it also gives people, it increases their capacity to deliver, and gives people a sense that, okay, we can take the next big step. And so I hope, because you're right, many of the proposals have multiple strategies embedded in them, finding the ones that will give them the greatest return immediately to create that trust that we were talking about, and then build from there. And I think Invest Southwest is even constructed that way. We are starting with commercial corridors because we know that this is the front door to many of the communities, and you can actually see change happening incrementally. But then we have to layer a housing preservation strategy, we have to layer a parks strategy, we have to layer a school strategy, and all of those things together will be a kind of transformational investment. But you have to start somewhere, and you have to start in a place that people care about, and that that involves the place that many people remember as being a vibrant commercial corridor of their community. I think we can do that in the 21st century.
In your experience, how important is philanthropy when it comes to rebuilding neighborhoods?
An important part. I'm coming from Detroit, where an ecosystem of foundations have always played a significant part in moving the city forward. But they also, and they have more latitude and flexibility often than government has. But when you really start to see things take off is when philanthropy, the private sector, and the public sector all get aligned. And it's a rare thing to see. But I actually believe this administration, with the directive that the mayor has given us, has helped folks see how they can take their mission and have it aligned with this. And so that process of getting community groups and their human resources that they will bring, foundations, public and private, is the goal. And I think foundations are incredibly vital because they give us the latitude, the freedom to do things that may even have a greater risk, that may require more patience, so yeah.
Go ahead.
Jen, if I could, one of the things, and it was inspired by something that Jose said that I think philanthropy also does, is it encourages us to think in terms of a different time standard for success than either politics does or the private sector does. And I think it also needs to be said social movements as well. All four of those are important sorts of drivers, potentially, of change. But you're talking about quarterly return on investment often in relation to thinking about the private sector. You're thinking about the 4-year election cycle in relation to the political process. You're talking about the urgency of now, often, in relation to social movements, which always has to be reckoned with, but you can't deliver, in a certain sense, the change that people want in that time. And philanthropy is uniquely positioned to think in terms of 5, 10, sometimes longer horizons, in terms of what's going to actually really constitute sustainable change, consequential change. And I think just that reorientation in terms of what our time frame is, around thinking about our actions, thinking about our commitments, thinking about the point to be able to appreciate what's been actually gained, is something that within a big, busy, urgent city that recognizes its problems is a rare, rare gift. I think it's as precious as the money. And in that sense, I think there's a real opportunity around this.
Cindy, can you build a little bit more on how we create sustainable models for investment?
Well, again, I think I don't have the answer. As I said, there's a lot of unknowns with community development and sustainable models. One thing I want to add to the idea of the long term is that when we sat down, and one of my trustees always says, we are the risk capital. We are the no-cost flexible capital that potentially can allow groups out there to bring in other funders. But the way that we've structured this prize, again, it's not clear if it's the right way or the wrong way, is that we are willing to put this money out in a 5-year period. It could be 1 year, it could be up to 5 years, but we're letting people assess impact for 10 years. Because really, it takes a very long time. There's a lot of, two of our trustees are in business. They understand real estate. They understand what it takes to move community and to make change, and how it takes tenacity and a long-term view. So we want to be a partner in that long-term view.
Commissioner Cox, as you said, you come to Chicago from Detroit, where the city is still recovering from bankruptcy, decades of population loss. Are there lessons you're taking from Detroit that you're applying here?
Sure. I think the main lesson that I learned was that the strategies that we deploy in communities, they have to first be driven by those who live there, those who stayed, those who have made decades-long investment. And so when I design a strategy with the community, it's genuinely for them. And it took a while for Detroiters to believe me when I said, we're not trying to attract some phantom population to your neighborhood. These are improvements for you. These streets, these parks, these preservation of housing, the restoration of iconic neighborhood buildings, these are for those who stayed. And when we started to show evidence that these changes were for them, their ability to stay with us for the longer, more difficult work increased. And I think there's a similar phenomena here. We have to stem the tide of people leaving the West and South sides. And the only way we can do that is by creating the amenities that people deserve for the investments that they have put into their neighborhoods. And so that's where you start. So this notion, and I've said it before, nothing about us without us is for us. It's a South African organizing slogan, and I believe it to my very core, that if we can design these strategies with residents, they will succeed.
Cindy, we are recognizing the 6 finalists today, but you received over 80 applications. There were 67 judges for the Chicago Prize. Any surprises, or how did you, I'm just imagining 80 applications and going through them and how you choose.
Well, first of all, one of the least surprising things is all of these applications were wonderful. They were all thoughtful. I would also say that to Commissioner Cox's point, most of them had things that you wouldn't be surprised are in there. Reuse of vacant lots or better park space, better amenities, affordable housing. These are things that every community wants. I mean, how these groups put them together were very compelling, and they convinced the judges, the review panel, that they rose to the top of some of the other ideas. But I do want to refocus everybody on the fact that when we gave out these brochures, we're showing you all 80 ideas because they all were incredibly valid ideas. 20 of them rose to the top through our review process, and I believe that the 14 that didn't move forward are fantastic ideas. I don't want people to not look at them or not contact somebody. They were just, they were different. Maybe they weren't as impactful or leveraged. So I would say that I'm just encouraging everyone to be open to all of these ideas. In terms of what's exciting, it's actually, I was thinking about this today as I was coming to see all of you, because many of you I've gotten a chance to meet and work with. About a year ago, my daughter got married. I was lucky enough to have a marriage in our family. And I said to her, don't forget to turn around and look around at all the people who have loved you and taken care of you and are here because this is an important day in your life. And the most exciting part for me and for I think our foundation is looking around the room and realizing that we are all here for the same purpose. We are all working towards the same goals. And we just continuously need to build up all of these folks who are working on our behalf. But I do have to say, looking around this room, I just want to say how phenomenal it is that we have so much talent, so much commitment, and I think it's what makes Chicago. I'm actually a transplant at Chicago, but I think this is what makes Chicago so incredibly special. So,
well, Jose, the prize is trying to encourage community organizations to work together, to act together in more coordinated ways. What do you find exciting about this approach?
The most exciting part for me is that we are starting to build more of a sense of collective power in neighborhoods and repairing, again, many of the relationships that have not been there because people do not want to cross the street. People do not want to go to their schools because their schools might have been closed. Where people now, because of this and many other efforts, have started going to meetings, to town halls, and are now being able to see their ideas and their vision being showcased and receiving support for it to become a reality. So being able to demonstrate that coming together and being civically minded is actually means something and could actually change the neighborhood, not just for themselves, but for the future of their family. I think that's incredibly powerful because we also need to build that civic infrastructure in our neighborhoods because that's the way in which we're going to ensure that the resources continue to come there.
And how do we see that roll up into into other parts of Chicagoans' lives?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to roll up not just on the economic side. It's going to roll up on the political side. I get excited about how it rolls up on the cultural side. I think we need a new house movement happening in our neighborhood. What's the new cultural, right? What's the new cultural contribution that Chicago is going to put forward? And it comes when people come together to be able to express who they are, where they come from, based on where we belong.
Mm-hmm. Adam, we started off talking about history. Mm-hmm. And as a historian, I spoke to a historian recently, and she's like, I'm not an optimist because I'm a historian. But when I hear you talk about Chicago, you sound optimistic.
Well, I think in some ways I am. I should come fully clean. I should come fully clean that I'm writing a book on Black happiness. So if you're not an optimist in relation to that, I guess there's nothing that puts you there. But I appreciate people. I appreciate people's humanity. I too am a transplant. I came from New York City. My mother came from Michigan, a little bit north of Detroit. My father came from Little Rock, Arkansas. And they met at Michigan State, and then they moved to New York City. And then I had the audacity to come to school at Chicago and eventually make this my home. And I think what I see all the time when I'm interacting with people, sometimes when I'm speaking, often when I'm listening, is that people are human here. They have a sense that their humanity, their human value, their ambition to live humane lives in this city is something that can actually bring people together. Jose and I were having a really interesting conversation in terms of thinking about indigenous heritage in relation to Chicago, which is often not consulted in terms of thinking about its past. And one of the things that became very clear was that this could be a city of flows. Mm-hmm. This could be a city where, like water, people move freely throughout the city. It's not been that, and a lot of this has to do, I think, with choices around built environment, choices around how to define neighborhoods, choices around guarding one's share of resources or one's concentration of resources against other communities. But we should figure out ways to make this city flow freely within itself. Mm-hmm. And when I see people advocating for that, I feel like that's a model for a community that I'm fortunate to be in conversation with, that I'm fortunate to learn from. So if I have optimism, it's coming from that. Mm.
Commissioner Cox, what do you make of that idea, a city of flows?
Well, I love it. I mean, I also love the fact that a historian could be optimistic. Designers are certainly optimistic. Planners have to believe in the future. I mean, I have one foot squarely set in the here and now about how to get things done, but my other foot is 30 years out, looking at the city that we want to be, and designing today for that future. So I'm an optimist, and I think that we can design the future we want. And if people come together and work diligently towards that, we can make it happen.
Mm-hmm. We have just about a minute left, so I want to give each of the panelists a chance to give any last words of advice to our finalists. Jose?
One of the most powerful things that I've learned in my role is the relationships that I've built with many of the people in this room doing this work, and the relationships that I think are going to sustain me throughout my life here in Chicago. And being able to be brought together to do this work as part of the competition, I think is great, but I would venture for you to also build those relationships outside of work and in other settings, because that's what's going to be able to make sure that we're connected in everything that we do here in our city.
Cindy, what about you?
So I love the idea that the commissioner just said he's looking 30 years out, he's going to see a changed city, maybe it's a flowing city. We're going to give you guys 6 months, and we're really excited to see what you come up with. It's a piece in the puzzle. We're going to keep working to the 30 years, but I'm really, I'm thrilled that you're all here. I'm really looking forward to working together with all of you to make your visions come to fruition. And we also, I just want to mention that part of what's going to happen is that LISC, who's a very important player in the city and a very important partner, has promised us that they want to highlight all of you at the LISC Award. And I think that's just one more step in this journey towards our incredible 30-year, long-term vision. So I'm looking forward to being part of this journey.
Adam?
Certainly trust the wisdom in your circle. Recognize that what you have in your conversations, in what you've acquired in terms of your experiences, is intelligence enough to launch yourself. And then be ambitious, audacious, and optimistic in terms of seeking the partnerships you need to leverage your dreams and your visions into something like a reality that we can all benefit from. And 30 years from now, we'll be thanking you for what it is that you contributed to us.
Commissioner Cox, I'll give you the last word.
I have enormous faith in the proposals, not just the 6 that were chosen, but so many others. And we have to understand that the prize has planted a seed. And it's not just one of these projects that will be realized. Multiple of these projects will be realized based on the resources that have you've been afforded and the kind of the brilliance of the idea. So I'm committing to more than one of these going forward.
But we were hoping you would say that.
Because I've seen it happen before. So for me, it is done. If we work together in partnership, we will make them happen.
Commissioner Cox, Professor Adam Green, Cindy Moelis, Jose Rico, thank you so much for this thoughtful conversation.
Thank you.